The younger you were, the more unforgiving you are of your parents. You may say, oh, they were so brave and saved you, but they really abandoned you. We were 4 friends, very close friends. We all agreed, if it ever happens again, we will not send away our children. We will stay and die together. That's what we said. Later on, as we grew older, we mitigated it. We said, if it ever happens, we promise to take each other's children in. We will not send them to strangers.
I certainly do my share of remembering, but remembering also has to have a present and a future perspective. You can't just stop at remembering. I don't think I ever made a conscious decision to devote myself to human rights and social justice issues. Someone helped me. I can't pay back or thank some of the people who helped me, but I can do something for other people.
Just making sure this works. Yep. Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome Deborah Oppenheimer, producer of Into the Arms of Strangers. And I prepared lots of questions, but forget these questions because what Deborah just said, she actually just got off the plane yesterday from England. and maybe you'll share with us what you were doing in England. Let me see. This is just. Start with this one. Christopher, please make sure. 1
second. I actually just got back last night. I went to London for the premiere of Downton Abbey, which was produced by my friend, but that was just the impetus for it. I spent a day out in the countryside with the grandson, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, and 3 great-great-grandchildren of a baronet and a lady who took my mother in and sheltered her in the attic servants' quarters of their castle for 2.5 years. And I also had dinner with the son and daughter-in-law of the woman who tried to get her parents out and ultimately got the letter back that said deported to Auschwitz. I met with a historian. I did lots of other things. It was a week filled with the Holocaust and the Kindertransport, and quite meaningful.
So let me go back to the beginning, because you decide to make this film that, of course, in 2001 wins an Oscar for Best Documentary, and it comes from a personal story. So maybe just for a few moments to share that personal story of your mother, who was one of those Kinder children, and at what point did you realize that this is a story that can't just live within you, but has to be told over and over for the story that we saw this evening?
So both of my parents were from Germany. My mother was from a town called Chemnitz near Dresden, and my father was from Bavaria in the south. They never talked about the Holocaust. My grandparents were these 2 silent photos in the living room that we never referenced. And I just knew a couple of things about my mother. She told me she lived with a lord and lady in a castle, but that didn't sound like the fairy tale that you would imagine. She told me she cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years, which was startling to hear from your parent. And she told me at the end of the war, she searched the posted names of survivors in Bloomsbury House looking for word of her parents' fate. That was about it. My siblings and I never discussed the Kindertransport. We never learned about it in the school. I never talked about it with any of my boyfriends or any of my friends. We knew nothing. And we were very fortunate to be sheltered from death. We didn't have a lot of experience of that in our family, and even when the family dog disappeared from the house one day, we were told that he was living with a nice family on a farm. And so when my mother was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 62 and a half, despite never having held a cigarette or smoked a cigarette, we knew time was very precious, and we knew we were in jeopardy of losing her story. But I needed a movie like this. I didn't know how to speak to her. I didn't know what to ask or how to find my way in, and I would fumble along, and she would start crying, and I would start crying, and I retreated for fear of doing her serious harm. And then when she did pass away at the age of 65, when we were sitting Shiva, my father came to me with this stack of tissue-thin letters with beautiful fountain pen handwriting, and he said, "Well, you're sentimental. You might want these." And they had been hidden from all of us. Even my father didn't know that they existed. They were letters that had been written every day from her parents. She had been encouraged to destroy the letters mostly because she might jeopardize her parents, or she might invite censure upon herself. But she hid a couple of the letters in her gas mask and in her shoes, and these were the letters that survived. So we were able to see from those letters the dates that she had departed. It was the end of the first week of August, which meant 3 weeks later, the Kindertransport would have ended. She would not have survived. I would not be here talking to you tonight. And it put a name to the places where she stayed, Hackney Hostel and Cockley Cly, which we figured out was the castle. I was attending an event at the Hilton, just up the street. I was invited to a dinner where my friend's father-in-law was being honored and given a plaque by Margaret Thatcher. And I don't know if my friend understood why she was inviting me. I certainly didn't know. And at some point in the dinner, they were playing all this archival footage like what you saw in the movie tonight. And I was just peering into this footage, wondering, is my mother in the footage? Would I recognize her if she were there? And then they asked all the people who were on the Kindertransport to stand. And the tables of graying and white-haired people stood up, and I thought, well, they live, they know each other, they speak to each other. And up until that point, when we tried to research the Kindertransport, the amount of sources we found filled this much of a typewritten page, and it wasn't even in the Encyclopedia Judaica. So I came back to my office in the morning and I said, look up K in the phone book. There's more out there that we don't know and that we haven't found. And my assistant came back and said, Eddie Nussbaum, Brentwood, California, is the head of the Southern California Kindertransport Association of America. And I went to see Eddie around the time of Purim in the late 90s, and he had a table of materials that he had laid out for me. He asked me a lot of questions, which I couldn't answer about my mother, and he was surprised about that. And it was painful to me not to be able to answer his questions. But he gave me all these materials, including Bertha Leverton's book, who was in the movie talking about her red-haired sister. And he gave me an application to a Kindertransport reunion that was taking place in London in the winter. And he gave me the name of a man named Kurt Goldberger, who lived on Long Island, where I had grown up. And I thought, well, if maybe my mother had known about Kurt Goldberger and the Kindertransport Association of America, maybe she could have, that would have been somebody she could speak to. So I made my way through all these materials, and then one day I finally sat down on a Sunday to call Kurt Goldberger and introduce myself and to be able to take notes. And a woman answered the phone with a very familiar voice to me. It was sort of German, tinged with British, tinged with American. And she answered her telephone, and I said, hello, can I please speak to Kurt Goldberger? And she said, yes, can I ask who's calling? And I said, my name is Debbie Oppenheimer. And she said, I know exactly who you are. I lived at Hackney Hostel in Cockley Clay with your mother. And so that opened the doors to learning a lot more about my mother's story.
So even though she didn't speak to you about that story, was there this secret world where she was speaking to these people, or that Kurt Goldberger did not know of had not heard of your mother until you called her?
They all knew my mother, but they had all fallen out of touch. It's the great diaspora when everybody left the castle and when the war ended and everybody scattered. They did not remain in touch, and so they were able to introduce me to people who had known my mother. In the end, I collected 1,000 letters that I found every girl who lived in this castle. I even flew to Israel and met with the matron who had come from Berlin on a domestic visa. And on a couple of the letters of one girl who had become a good friend of my mother's, my mother had written messages on her letters to her parents. She would say, this is my best friend, Silva, and I could see my mother's handwriting that never changed.
I just want to go back in history for a moment and speak about two people that appeared in the film, both Norbert Wilheim and Nicholas Winton, because it took two to tango. You had to have somebody in Germany having a plan to get to England, and you have on the other side. Maybe you could just explain a little about who these individuals were and how there was no email, there was no text message. How did these two people work together to create this miracle?
So Norbert Wilheim was in Berlin. He was a social worker with a wife and a very young child. And the Kindertransport started up very quickly after Kristallnacht, and they had all this paperwork and all these children to process and all these parents trying to get their children out because the final solution had not yet been implemented. So the systematic killing had not begun, although people were killed on Kristallnacht. And so this was a way out. It was not ideal because you had to make a choice to send your children unaccompanied, but a lot of people were signing up. They had lost their businesses. They could no longer employ staff who were not Jewish. They could not go certain places, sit certain places. The children could no longer go to school. So they saw the handwriting on the wall, but not for the ultimate outcome. And so Norbert was enlisted to help, and he tried to decline and was offered help himself to get out. And so he helped organize all the paperwork, and he helped process thousands of children. I once heard the number 6,000 children, and he even accompanied some of the transports to England and then turned around and came back so as not to jeopardize the rescue effort or his wife or his child. And in the end, we all know what happened, and he was not able to get out. He was deported to Auschwitz at the selection. He was sent one way, his wife and child were sent the other. He never saw them again, so he suffered this horrific irony of having rescued thousands of children and not being able to save his own child. We have a lot to thank Norbert for. He brought the first class action suit against I.G. Farben for slave labor and won a $6.43 million settlement, I believe. And we kept hearing about Norbert. The rescuers who you're asking about were not, by and large, not alive anymore when we started filming in the late 90s, in 1999. And so we were searching everywhere for the adults in the story. We're lucky to hear about Norbert, and everywhere we went, the United States Holocaust Museum, friends of his in Berlin, and even his wife said, you have to hurry, you have to rush, he's not well. And so we were able to raise some money, and we flew to New York and conducted his interview, and 5 weeks later he passed away. And his wife said that he rallied for one final testimony, and having accomplished it, felt sufficiently at peace to let go. In the case of Nicholas Winton, he was not, if you are not familiar with him except for our movie, I would urge you to Google the New York Times obituary of Nicholas Winton when you go home tonight. It was on the front page, and I think it elicited 700 or 900 responses. It was so inspiring and so moving. But he was going to go on a ski vacation. A friend of his said, no, come to Czechoslovakia. You need to see what's going on there. Doreen Warrener. And he went and he saw, and he came back to England and got involved and started writing letters, made up phony stationery, and helped was responsible for helping to rescue, I think, 669 children from Czechoslovakia. There was one final transport with 250 children that was on the train station on the day the war broke out, and those children did not get out. They are now making a movie of Nicholas Winton's life. Anthony Hopkins will play him. And there's also, I think, a 10-part documentary being made, a scripted series being made. So Nicholas Winton has gotten a lot of attention as of the year 2000 and beyond. He got recognized in the Czech Republic. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, and he lived to 106. So he received quite a bit of the attention he deserved that he had not gotten all through his life because he did not speak about what he had done.
So it's interesting that you said that you went back and tried to find the adults who were the I guess you can call it foster parents of these children. And just this past weekend in the Times of Israel, there's a fascinating article that they were going back and trying to find the foster siblings. Have you had experience finding any of these foster siblings and hearing their experience within the documentary? Some of the children spoke about it wasn't, all glory days having these new siblings, and these new siblings felt a little cramped in their own families. What has been the experience about finding those siblings, and if you have, what are their stories?
We did speak to quite a few siblings, and it was good and it was bad experiences. We always say that there were 10,000 children, and therefore there were 10,000 stories. So in some cases, like in the case of Kurt Fuchel, who talks about having 4 parents, what more could he wish for? He stayed in touch with his foster sibling John his entire life. The Richard Attenborough, who has passed away, but his brother David Attenborough, their family took in 2 girls, and they stayed in touch with them their entire life. And then there are other people, the way Laurie Siegel describes, where she entered the family. They didn't love her. She didn't love them, but they had the grace to take in a child. So the stories range across the full spectrum of people who stayed in touch their entire lives. My mother, after she left the castle, there was an appeal in a synagogue in London to take in a child for a Jewish holiday. So she was taken in first for one holiday, and then a second, and then another. I wouldn't say that placement was entirely successful. However, it was a newlywed couple, and they had a baby while my mother was there, and my mother clutched this baby to her as if she were her own personal living doll. And that was probably the reason we knew my mother was rescued, because she stayed in touch with this girl her entire life, and we are still in touch with her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren.
I want to fast forward for a moment and ask a Hollywood question, because this film did win an Oscar. What was the reason that it was Oscar-worthy, obviously in the Oscar eyes, but also at that moment in 2001, what did it do to propel that story beyond a Yom HaShoah commemoration in a synagogue?
I just want to go back a moment, because you asked me a question I didn't answer, which was when I knew this was going to be a movie. Yeah. And I think I knew it at the point that I heard about the reunion 9 months down the line in London, and I thought, I think I'm supposed to be there with a camera. I was a television producer at Warner Brothers. I was running a prolific production company there, but nothing to do with documentaries. But it occurred to me that maybe this was a documentary, and I was fortunate to surround myself with excellent documentary filmmakers. We were also lucky to partner with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on an official level, which rarely happens. They've done that a handful of times. And so my big agenda was for people to learn about the Kindertransport in the way that when I grew up was unfamiliar to people when we first started researching the movie, and I would call around people. I'd say, I want to speak to people about the Kindertransport, and they would say to me, kidney transplant. And so it was always important to me to try to make a film that was unassailable, which is a pretty tricky word to use. And a tricky ambition to have, but my concern was that this might be the only way people get their information about the Kindertransport, and so we wanted to be very careful that there not be any errors in it, and so we just moved heaven and earth for everybody. It was a labor of love for everybody at Warner Brothers who worked on this. They utilized all their connections. They were very proud to be contributing to this film. We lost our funding at one point and collapsed, and Warner Brothers came in and rescued us, a man named Barry Meyer, who went on to become the chairman of the board of Warner Brothers, but made this decision prior to his promotion. And as we got closer to the Oscars, people kept saying, you have a chance. And the Oscars are like an election. You really don't know what's going to happen, but you hope because you know that it expands your audience. And for a documentary, that's what you need. And so that is what happened when we won. I think 1 billion people in 150 countries heard the word Kindertransport. That helped to overcome the kidney transplant thing from then on. And it did make a difference. Here it is, 2022. The movie came out in 2000. We won in 2001. And I'm here tonight. In a couple of weeks, I'll be speaking to a bunch of classes at a Catholic school in Connecticut. And so only 2 of the people in the movie are still alive. And so the time is coming where movies, museums, Yom HaShoah commemorations, our children, family members, the artifacts are what will remain to tell these stories. We haven't asked if there are Kindertransport survivors or descendants or family members. A couple.
Just stand up and rise. Just want to acknowledge and thank you. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Very glad you could be here. Thank you.
So I have one last question. Then I want to open it up to questions and answers from our congregation this evening. Just yesterday, or actually a couple of days ago, the ADL came out with an audit that there's 2,717 anti-Semitic incidents this year. It's a 34% increase year after year. And you mentioned the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which you've been active in not just creating the film, but actually creating study materials for our next generation. Tomorrow morning, our young children in our Sinai Keep Academy will be wearing black and white to commemorate Yom HaShoah in a ceremony as well, as our children begin to hear the story that you as a child or a child of a survivor never heard until your adult life. How do we educate our young, not just through this film, but through those materials? And maybe you can explain where those materials have gone outside of the Jewish world as well.
Well, I think we've all heard that we've reached a time where people no longer know what the phrase 6 million means, that there's tremendous denial, there's tremendous anti-Semitism. It took quite some time for Deborah Lipstadt to be approved to be the first anti-Semitism cabinet level position. She teaches this movie every semester in her class at Emory. I think she'll be taking a break from that. We have to keep talking about it. We have to keep asking questions. I think that the word bystander, from having done this movie, has become very important to me. There weren't just perpetrators and victims, there were bystanders who saw what was going on, and I think and that has become very vivid to us in all kinds of issues in our world today, and I think that it's something we have to stand up and do and educate our children, be models of how to conduct oneself, and to hope that other people will take on those lessons. It's a challenge.
So I want to open it up to questions from our audience. I know, is there a microphone that's around there as well? Okay, yeah, please stand. I'll repeat because we're also streaming for, I know people are watching actually around the country as well. Yep, please.
The question is, did my mother not tell me what happened to her? Yes, that's correct. Yes, she turned 11 years old, had a birthday celebration, and then 2 weeks later was put on the train. I think she didn't tell me for a couple of reasons. I think it was unbearable for her to talk about. She couldn't talk about it. One of the survivors in our movie helped me to understand also that she was shielding me and she was trying to protect me.
Marcy? Mm. Just want to repeat what Marcy said for those who are also watching. Marcy's mother was one of the children on the Kindertransport, and also didn't speak about the experience until she went to the reunion, and she said, "I'm not a survivor because I was on the Kindertransport," and they said, "Actually, if you stayed in Germany, you might not be alive right now, so you are a survivor," and that opened up the opportunity. Do you think there were a lot of those moments
think that's
that
very
people were looking
typical.
for that opportunity to perhaps open?
So two things. I think it's exactly typical that these children did not view themselves as survivors, and they were extremely modest and reluctant to use that phrase. They knew in many cases what had happened to their parents, their neighbors, their relatives, and that they had not gone through the camps, so they did not use that word on themselves. I can say that the United States Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, all these institutions recognize them as survivors. And I think it was divided. I think we find this among veterans of our various wars, that I've encountered this with people who went through the apartheid experience, that these horrific experiences, very oftentimes people don't speak about. The Bertha Leverton's efforts to create this Kindertransport reunion movement that is continued now by the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees in England, and the Kindertransport Association of America that is here and led by Melissa Hacker. I think that this has been very important and very cathartic and meaningful, going back to Bertha's very first reunion that she did because she looked at her 14-year-old grandson and she thought, nobody knows her story, it's going to disappear, nobody will have known what happened to people. And so she thought she'd gather a few people together. It attracted 1,000 survivors and family members, and parents started to speak to children, grandparents to grandchildren, people started to speak in schools. I still have met many people who have never spoken to their children, or children who said that their late parent never spoke to them. But it did begin to open up a bit.
Myra? So Myra also shared the experience of growing up as a child of survivors. Same experience as Marcy, as Debbie, and a parent shielding their child, while also later on in life learning the story. Jamie and then Malcolm?
The question is, what happened to the children after the war? Did she stay with the families, or did they stay with the families, or did they go somewhere else? I always say that the children had everywhere and nowhere to go. They were not necessarily going to go back to an inhospitable country who was killing them and their like. And so in my mother's case, she came to New York because she had a relative there who could sponsor her. People went everywhere. They were not necessarily attached to the people who had taken them in. In many cases, they had bounced around from placement to placement. And so by then, they had been in England 6 years. In the case of Kurt Fuchel, he was there for 9 years so that he could complete his education. They were growing up. They were becoming young adults. And most of them were sent to work at a very young age, certainly a younger age than what they might have expected had their family remained intact. And also a great many of them, to their tremendous shame, lost their education, which also would not have happened had they remained with their families. And so they made their way in the world. Some of the kids did go on to get an education. A lot of the girls went to secretarial school. A lot of the people had worked in factories during the war, making their keep, and so they scattered everywhere. Siblings were separated, never got back. I heard so many stories of people who went 25 years before they saw a sibling again. In my mother's case, she never saw her brother again. In the case of other people I know, never saw their sibling again because they got scattered and they couldn't afford the travel.
Malcolm? So I'll paraphrase what Malcolm said, an amazing story. Malcolm first heard about the Kindertransport here at Sinai Temple. Jerry Hornstein, a longtime Sinai Temple member, leads the morning service on Rosh Hashanah, the New Year. And he heard the melody similar to what Malcolm grew up in Glasgow, Scotland, where his father was a rabbi. And he asked him how he knew that. And he said because from the Kindertransport, which he was on, then he went to a hostel in Glasgow, Scotland, which was part of Malcolm's father's synagogue. But the stories were connected actually here in Sinai Temple. So an amazing story of this community bringing together. And we'll go here, and then is that Jerry Nagin? Good to see you, Jerry. And we'll end with conclude with Jerry. Yep. Rabbi Dr. Schoenfeld.
We're very aware of him while we were making the movie. I think there's been a project done about him. We were not able to fit any stories about him in the film.
Did he play a significant role in the Kindertransport?
I believe he did, yeah.
And Jerry Nagin. Oh, sorry. Jerry, and then one more. Yep.
That's a great question. What was the experience of the Jewish kids when there were not necessarily Jewish homes? So you're absolutely correct. So again, the experience was across the spectrum, which is what I've encountered with other Holocaust stories, where in my mother's case, she felt very, very, very connected to her Judaism. We could feel when we were in synagogue that the songs, the prayers ran very deep for her. In other cases, I ran into people who felt, where was God? How could God let this happen? And who people turned away from their faith. In the case of the people who took children in, there were not enough Jewish families who came forward. So when my mother was in the castle, this family certainly, I don't think, had any Jewish people in their lives, but the matron who accompanied the children until she was sent away as an enemy alien came from an Orthodox Jewish family, and she persuaded this lady, officially a lady, to turn the flower cutting room into a kosher kitchen. And in the beginning, they did get kosher meat for the girls. That she was not able to keep that up, but she made efforts. Nicholas Winton was very much attacked because he could, with rescuing 669 children, and all of these children needed to have a 50-pound guarantee put forth for them, which was intended for their eventual re-emigration. It was never intended that these children would stay in England. And he couldn't find 50 pounds back then would be, I've been told, about, well, when we were doing the movie, it was the equivalent of about $1,500, which was a lot of money for these families to put up. And so he did not have enough families, and some of the children wound up with Christadelphians who wanted to convert them, and he was under tremendous attack for having put these children with these people. And there's a line that he says in our movie, and you don't hear the entire context, but what he says is, I would say that they were alive at the end of the war. And he simply couldn't find enough people. So again, completely across the spectrum of people's experience of preserving their heritage. The sad thing is, I believe that with some very, very young children who wouldn't have known and left their homes too early, that they might not have, we don't know what they knew of their heritage.
And one final question.
I'm glad you brought that up. What was the role of the Quakers? Judi Dench was the narrator of that film. We believe that she represented the Universal Mother, and what we found out when she agreed to do the film was that she was a Quaker, and that her husband had been sent away like other London children to escape the anticipated bombing at the start of the war. So there had been many people trying to get the Jews out and into England without success. And it was finally the events of Kristallnacht that made that happen. But it wasn't just Jews, it was also Christian groups, and it was the Quakers. So I'm glad you brought it up, because the Quakers and Christians deserve recognition for having contributed to getting Jews out. But again, it was only unaccompanied minors. There was never a limit set to the number of people who would be rescued, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, it was from infancy up to 17 years of age. That was the cutoff point. But it was a collaborative effort which was what was needed the number of people. This was in over a 9-month period. 10,000 children were saved.
So last week we sat at our Seder tables and we told the story of the Exodus from Egypt, from slavery to freedom. It seems like a story that is almost dreamlike. 1 week later we sit here with the brilliance and wisdom of Deborah's foreshadowing of continuing to tell this story. And we thank you for being here. We're honored that you're, of course, part of our Sinai Temple family. And we're going to conclude with these 3 words of memory. Yehi zichram baruch. May those who perish truly be lives be a blessing and a memory for all time. Amen. Have a good evening.
I just wanted to say thank you again. You're so beautiful. Yeah, you did. I mean, it really, there were so many pieces of it that I went, yeah, she does that. Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Was this the first time seeing it?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
My
I'm
second
so glad
time.
you did.
So my mother sends
Thank
regards. She had seen it many years ago.